These are 1,800 men from 2 different countries who were trained to be thrown away on a suicide mission in Norway, and who instead became the most feared unit on the Italian front. This is the story of the 1st Special Service Force, the joint American and Canadian brigade that fought for 251 days, absorbed casualties totaling 134% of its own strength, and, according to the legend, earned its nickname from the very enemy who dreaded it, the Black Devils. That legend is exactly where the trouble starts, because almost everything most people think they know about the Devil's Brigade sits somewhere on the border between documented fact and wartime myth. The diary found on a dead German, the name whispered in terror across no man's land, the 25-to-1 kill ratio, all of it lives in that uncertain space. So this video is going to do something most tellings of this story refuse to do. It is going to separate what actually happened from what was invented, and show you that the truth is stranger, harder, and more impressive than the movie version. Let's begin where the force itself began, not on a battlefield, but with an eccentric English inventor and a plan so flawed that the very man chosen to lead it called it a fiasco to his commanders' faces. The 1st Special Service Force was born from an idea that never actually happened. In March of 1942, a civilian inventor named Geoffrey Pike walked into the British Combined Operations Command with a proposal. Pike was no soldier. Working on the staff of Lord Louis Mountbatten, the chief of Combined Operations, he carried a reputation for ideas that hovered somewhere between genius and lunacy, and this was the same man who would later propose building aircraft carriers out of reinforced ice. Pike's proposal carried the code name Project Plough. The concept ran like this. You would parachute a small, elite force of winter warfare commandos into German-occupied Norway to destroy hydroelectric power plants, and the target mattered enormously, because Norway's hydroelectric plants supplied roughly 49% of the country's power. One of those plants, at a place called Rjukan, tied into something far more sinister than electricity, producing heavy water, a critical ingredient in German atomic research. Pike's plan did not stop at Norway. It also imagined strikes against the Ploiești oil fields in Romania and targets in the Italian Alps. A handful of men dropped from the sky, wrecking the industrial backbone of the Axis war machine across an entire continent. One problem stood in the way. To move across the Norwegian snow, the commandos would need a vehicle that did not exist yet, and here we find the first of this story's strange cross-connections. The vehicle developed for Project Plough became the M29 Weasel, a tracked snow vehicle built by the Studebaker Corporation, the same company that in peacetime built family automobiles. Its engineering drew on input from a Canadian inventor named George Klein. Designed for a mission to Norway that would never launch, the Weasel went on to serve in terrains its designers never imagined, a small preview of a pattern you will see again and again in this story, where nearly everything about the 1st Special Service Force was built for one purpose and then used for a completely different one. The Weasel deserves to be understood as more than a footnote, because its fate mirrors the fate of the force itself. Here was a machine purpose-built, at real expense and engineering effort, for one specific mission, crossing Norwegian snow to reach Norwegian power plants, and that mission evaporated. So the Weasel, like the men it was meant to carry, went looking for a war to be useful in. When the force finally reached the mountains of Italy, the terrain proved so rugged that the men found ordinary mules more useful than their specialized snow vehicles. Of 100 of the vehicles shipped for the Italian campaign, only 12 were even uncrated in January of 1944. A machine engineered for one of the most specific missions of the war ended up largely sidelined by the humble mule, which is the story of the force in miniature, elaborate preparation for one war followed by improvisation in another. The impulse behind the Weasel, though, points to something that outlasted the war entirely. The problem Pike and his engineers were trying to solve, how you move a small team quickly across terrain that stops everyone else, is a problem that never went away. In its purest form it is a mobility problem, the same class of problem that drives the design of everything from modern polar research vehicles to the specialized transports that carry small teams across deserts and mountains today. The specific machine failed to matter, but the problem it was built to solve turned out to be permanent. Geoffrey Pike is worth lingering on for a moment, because the character of the men who conceived the force tells you how improbable its origins truly were. No general, no strategist, no soldier of any kind, Pike was a civilian inventor attached to the staff of British Combined Operations Command, a men whose mind produced ideas at a rate and of a strangeness that both fascinated and exhausted the professionals around him. The plan he handed to the British High Command was almost fantastical in its ambition: a single elite force, dropped from the sky, capable of paralyzing the Axis war economy across 3 separate theaters: the hydroelectric heart of Norway, the oil fields of Romania, and the mountain passes of Italy. It was the kind of plan that could only come from someone unburdened by the practical experience of trying to move and supply soldiers in the field. The strategic instinct beneath the fantasy was sound, though. Norway really did matter. Those hydroelectric plants really did supply roughly 49% of the country's power, and the heavy water produced at Rjukan really was a component of German atomic research. Pike had identified genuine vulnerabilities in the Axis machine. What he had not solved, what he perhaps had no way to solve, was the question of how a handful of men could reach those vulnerabilities, destroy them, and survive. That gap between a brilliant target and an impossible method would define the force's entire early existence. Britain, stretched thin across a global war, lacked the resources to execute Plough itself, and that's when the plan crossed the Atlantic. At the Chequers Conference in March 1942, the proposal was offered to the United States, and General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, accepted it. That acceptance set in motion the creation of a unit unlike any other in the war. An idea born in the mind of an English civilian inventor, championed by Lord Mountbatten's Combined Operations Command, was about to be handed to the United States Army and turned into something its originator could never have built on his own. Here is the part that should have doomed the whole thing. In May of 1942, a major named Robert T. Frederick was asked to review Project Plough, and Frederick studied it carefully before concluding that it amounted to a military fiasco. His objections were not vague. He argued that the objectives were wildly unrealistic for the number of troops involved. He pointed out that a small elite unit would be outnumbered and overwhelmed the moment it tried to hold any captured ground. He noted there was no definite way to evacuate the troops once a mission was complete. And most damning of all, he observed that no aircraft were actually available to fly the men into Norway in the first place. The plan, in short, was a way to insert brave men into enemy territory with no realistic way to bring them home. Robert Frederick had written what amounted to a death certificate for Project Plough, and that's when the U.S. Army did something that only makes sense in retrospect. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then head of the War Plans Division, read Frederick's criticisms, and he chose Frederick, the plan's single greatest detractor, to build and command the unit anyway. On the 16th of June, 1942, Eisenhower assigned Frederick the job. Promoted to colonel, Frederick was handed the task of turning a plan he despised into a fighting force. This became one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the war, because the mission Frederick had been ordered to prepare for was cancelled within months, and yet the unit he built to execute it would outlive the plan and rewrite what North America believed elite soldiers could do. To understand the force, you have to understand the man Eisenhower chose. Robert Tryon Frederick entered the world in San Francisco on the 14th of March, 1907, and graduated from West Point in the class of 1928, though not a spectacular graduate on paper, finishing 124th in a class of roughly 250, squarely in the middle. Nothing about his academic record predicted what he would become. What Frederick possessed was something the classroom does not measure, a combination of organizational brilliance and raw physical courage that would make him, by the war's end, one of the most decorated and most respected combat commanders the United States produced. The measure of that courage is written in his wounds. Over the course of the war, Robert Frederick was wounded 8 separate times, earning 8 Purple Hearts, and this was no commander who directed the fighting from a safe distance and studied maps. Repeatedly present at the sharpest edge of combat, close enough to be hit again and again, he kept leading. His decorations accumulated to a degree that reads almost like a misprint: 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Medals, a Silver Star, 2 Legions of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars, on top of those 8 Purple Hearts. He would go on to become the youngest Major General in the United States Army, and later to command the 1st Airborne Task Force and the 45th Infantry Division. The judgment of one of the most famous figures of the era, relayed through the historian John Nadler, was blunt, calling him the greatest fighting general of all time, with the added remark that a dozen more like him might have smashed the war years earlier. Whatever one makes of such praise, the man it described was the one now charged with building an impossible unit for a doomed mission, and he would build it in his own image, from the front. To grasp just how unusual the 1st Special Service Force was, you have to understand what it was made of. This was the only joint American and Canadian unit formed in the entire Second World War. Not an American unit with Canadians attached, not a Canadian unit under American command, but a genuinely binational fighting force, activated on the 9th of July, 1942, at Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, Montana. The original vision reached even further than what emerged. Frederick's force was initially meant to draw on 3 nationalities in roughly equal parts, American, Canadian, and Norwegian, and the Norwegian element made sense given the Norway mission. There simply weren't enough suitable Norwegians available, so the final composition settled into 2 halves, 900 Americans and 900 Canadians, for a total of around 1,800 men. The Canadian arrangement walked a bureaucratic tightrope. In July of 1942, the Canadian Minister of National Defence, James Ralston, approved 697 officers and men, and these Canadian soldiers remained legally part of the Canadian Army. Canada paid them. Canadian military law disciplined them, but the U.S. Army uniformed them, fed them, equipped them, and housed them. On paper, the Canadian contingent carried the official designation of the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion, a name it received in the spring of 1943. Unofficially, the men called it the 2nd Canadian Parachute Battalion, a deliberately misleading cover name meant to obscure what the unit actually was. The structure of the force reflected its unusual mission, organized into 3 regiments, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, plus a service battalion. In a sign of just how special this unit was considered, it answered directly to the combined chiefs of staff. Each regiment was led by a lieutenant colonel and consisted of 32 officers and 385 men, broken into 2 battalions of 3 companies each, with 3 platoons to a company and 2 sections to a platoon. It was a compact, self-contained organization designed for a specific kind of violence. At the top stood Robert Frederick, the man who had called the whole enterprise a fiasco, and his second-in-command was a Canadian, in keeping with the binational spirit of the force. When one Canadian officer, Lieutenant Colonel McQueen, broke his leg during parachute training, the senior Canadian role passed to Lieutenant Colonel Don Williamson, who led the 2nd Regiment. But an organizational chart does not make soldiers. What transformed these men into something dangerous happened at Fort Harrison, in the mountains of Montana, over the winter of 1942 and into 1943. Fort William Henry Harrison was chosen for a very specific reason, and it reveals what kind of soldiers the force was meant to produce. The location offered flat terrain suitable for airborne training, positioned right up against mountains suitable for skiing and winter warfare. Frederick needed men who could jump out of aircraft and men who could fight in the snow, and Montana let him train for both at once. The secrecy surrounding the operation bordered on the paranoid. When the recruits traveled by train, the windows of the troop cars were painted black so that no one could see where they were going or guess what they were becoming. In a very literal sense, the men were being carried into the dark. The recruitment itself tells you everything about the intended character of the unit. The force sought single men between the ages of 21 and 35, with at least 3 years of high school education, but the preferred occupations listed in the recruitment letters read less like a military circular and more like a frontier adventure novel. They wanted rangers, lumberjacks, north woodsmen, hunters, prospectors, explorers, and game wardens, the trades of men who already knew how to survive in wilderness and cold, comfortable with hardship and isolation. Married men were turned away, and the Canadian screening ran so demanding that rejection rates climbed as high as 50%, meaning half of all Canadian applicants were sent home. The training opened with a shock designed to weed out the hesitant. Parachute training started within 48 hours of a recruit's arrival, with no training towers and no preliminary orientation flights. For many of these men, their very first parachute jump was also the first time they had ever been in an aircraft. Frederick's logic was brutal and effective, finding out immediately who would jump and who would freeze. The schedule that followed was punishing, unfolding across 3 phases. From August to October came the foundations, parachuting, weapons, demolitions, small unit tactics, and relentless physical training, with reveille at 4:30 in the morning. From October into November came unit tactics and problem solving, the men learning to operate as coordinated teams. And from November all the way through to the following July came the winter warfare that was the whole point of the enterprise: skiing, rock climbing, cold weather adaptation, and training on that purpose-built M29 Weasel. The physical standards became legend within the force. There was a 60-mile march course, and the record for completing it belonged to the 1st Regiment, under Colonel A.C. Marshall, at 20 hours. 60 miles, on foot, in 20 hours. And then there was the matter of learning to kill up close. The hand-to-hand combat instructor was a man named Dermot O'Neill, known as Pat, a former member of the Shanghai Municipal Police who had learned his craft in one of the most violent policing environments on Earth. Shanghai in that era was a byword for danger, a city where the police dealt in close-quarters violence as a matter of routine, and O'Neill had emerged from that world with a body of practical knowledge about ending fights that no ordinary military instructor possessed. O'Neill taught the men to attack the eyes, the throat, the groin, and the knees, the targets that end a fight fastest, with no concern for the conventions of sport or the notion of a fair contest. He drilled them in knife techniques and quick-draw pistol work. This was no sport. It was instruction in how to end a human life in seconds, silently, in the dark. The skiing, meanwhile, came from Norwegian instructors, a fitting detail, given that the whole enterprise had been aimed at Norway in the first place. The men were being shaped by an international faculty of specialists, a Shanghai policeman teaching them to kill, Norwegian skiers teaching them to move, all of it converging on a single lethal competence. The philosophy embedded in that training deserves to be understood, because it explains what the force became. Conventional infantry training in that era was, by necessity, mass production, turning enormous numbers of civilians into serviceable soldiers as quickly as possible. What happened at Fort Harrison ran closer to the opposite: a small number of carefully selected men subjected to an intense, prolonged, multidisciplinary program that assumed each of them could master a range of difficult skills: parachuting, demolitions, skiing, rock climbing, silent killing, small unit tactics, and cold weather survival. The bet was that a small number of highly capable generalists, each able to do many things well, would prove worth far more than their numbers suggested. That bet, quality of individual capability over quantity of bodies, is the founding premise of every elite special operations unit that exists today, and it was being tested, for one of the first times at this scale in North America, in the snow of Montana. The men were also armed and marked in ways that set them apart from any conventional unit. One of the force's favored weapons was the M1941 Johnson light machine gun, prized for the volume of fire it could put out, which mattered for small teams who might suddenly need to generate the firepower of a much larger group. The men also trained to use captured German weapons, a skill that sounds like a minor detail but would prove decisive in the mountains of Italy, where forcemen turned captured German machine guns against the very soldiers who had been firing them. There is even a chilling footnote to the force's weapons development, because Frederick's staff at one point considered arming the men with blow darts, then rejected the idea specifically because it might be considered a war crime. That such a thing was even on the table tells you the mindset in which this unit was conceived. But the weapon that became the symbol of the force was a knife. Called the V-42 Stiletto, it was designed specifically for these men. Frederick had seen the British Fairbairn-Sykes commando knife during his time in Britain, and the V-42 grew out of that design, co-created by Frederick and his officers and made purely for the force. Everything about it was engineered for killing rather than utility. It carried a narrow, double-edged, high-carbon steel blade meant for thrusting. It carried a thumb groove built into the design to guide a horizontal thrust, a thrust aimed between the ribs. And it carried a pointed pommel, sometimes called a skull crusher, at the base of the grip. This was no tool for opening ration cans or cutting rope. It was an instrument designed for one purpose, and its presence in the force's equipment says as much about the unit's mission as any training schedule. The V-42 would go on to become a lasting symbol, its shape echoing in the insignia of special operations units that came after. The force marked itself visually as well, and even the patch on the shoulder told the story of the unit's dual nature. The insignia was a red spearhead, with the word USA written horizontally. Across it and the word Canada written vertically, the two words crossing to form a white letter T, a design that literally spelled out the binational composition of the force in a single symbol. The branch insignia was the crossed arrows once worn by the U.S. Army's Indian Scouts, and the unit was in fact unofficially first called the Braves, which is where the spearhead came from. The men also wore a braided cord, a forager in red, white, and blue, made from parachute suspension cord, a small badge of their airborne identity woven from the very equipment that had carried them out of aircraft. There is a small human detail buried in the training records that captures the strangeness of merging two national armies into one. Canadian bagpipers were folded into the American marching bands. Marching commands, which differed between the two armies, had to be homogenized so that Americans and Canadians could drill as a single body. Two military cultures, with different traditions and different words of command, were deliberately blended until the seam disappeared. By the time the training finished, you could no longer easily tell where the American force ended and the Canadian force began, which was exactly the point. That deliberate erasure of the national seam deserves attention, because it was genuinely unusual and genuinely difficult. Armies rank among the most tradition-bound institutions humans build. The word of command a sergeant barks, the way a column wheels on parade, the instrument that leads the march, these things carry decades of national identity. To take two such institutions and fuse them at the level of the individual soldier, so that an American and a Canadian could stand in the same section and respond to the same command as one body, required someone to decide, deliberately, which traditions would survive and which would be sanded away. The result was something that had not existed before, not an alliance of two armies cooperating, but a single unit in which the nationality of the men beside you was, for operational purposes, invisible. The men would later say that within the force, the distinction between American and Canadian simply stopped mattering. It stands as one of the quiet achievements of the whole enterprise, and it foreshadows the binational special operations partnership that survives between the two countries to this day. But here we arrive at the first great irony of the story. All of this, the black-windowed trains, the wilderness recruits, the 430 Reveilles, the purpose-built snow vehicle, was preparation for a mission that would never happen. In the fall of 1942, Project Plow was cancelled. The reasons were practical. The mission had always been a logistical fantasy, exactly as Frederick had warned. And then the strategic rationale evaporated entirely, because the Norwegian heavy water plants, the crown jewel target that had partly justified the whole enterprise, were destroyed in February of 1943, not by Frederick's force, but by Norwegian agents of the Special Operations Executive. The very targets the first Special Service Force had been built to attack were eliminated by other hands before the force ever left North America. So now the U.S. Army faced a problem. It had spent months building an elite, highly trained, expensive, and utterly unique fighting unit for a mission that no longer existed. The obvious bureaucratic move would have been to break the force up and distribute its superbly trained men across other units. That did not happen. The force was kept together, intact, a solution in search of a problem. The decision to keep the force together, when the logic of the moment argued for dissolving it, turned out to be one of the quiet turning points of the whole story. Institutions rarely preserve things that have lost their stated purpose, since the natural gravity of any large organization pulls toward reabsorbing an orphaned unit and reallocating its people. Someone, or several someones, decided instead that this particular collection of men, with their unusual training, their binational character, and their honed and specialized skills, was worth keeping intact even without a mission to point them at. That decision preserved the thing that would, within a year, prove itself on Monte La Difensa and at Anzio. Had the force been broken up in the fall of 1942, as bureaucratic logic suggested, the entire legend, the entire lineage, the entire proof of concept would simply never have existed. The men would have scattered into other units, good soldiers in ordinary formations, and history would never have known the Devil's Brigade. For a time, the men trained without a purpose, their skills honed to a razor's edge with no enemy to use them against. They relocated from Montana to Camp Bradford, Virginia, on the 15th of April, 1943, for amphibious training at Norfolk, because when you do not know where a unit will fight, you train it to fight anywhere. On the 23rd of May, they moved to Fort Ethan Allen in Vermont. An elite force was being shuttled around the eastern United States, its commanders searching for somewhere to send it. That somewhere, when it finally came, was almost absurdly anticlimactic, and it happened at the far northwestern edge of the North American continent. On the 4th of July, 1943, the first Special Service Force arrived at the San Francisco port of embarkation, and 6 days later, on the 10th of July, they sailed. Their destination was the Aleutian Islands, that long chain of cold, fog-shrouded volcanic rocks stretching off the coast of Alaska toward Japan. Specifically, they were headed for the island of Kiska, which Japanese forces had occupied, in an operation codenamed Cottage. On the 15th of August, 1943, the force landed on Kiska, braced for a bloody fight against dug-in Japanese defenders. There were no Japanese defenders. In one of the more remarkable feats of the Pacific War, the Japanese garrison, roughly 5,183 troops, had secretly evacuated the island under cover of fog in late July, slipping away around the 28th and 29th before the Allied landings. The force stormed ashore onto an empty island. The great combat debut of the most intensively trained unit in North America turned out to be a landing against no one. The Japanese evacuation of Kiska deserves its own moment of recognition, because it was a genuinely masterful piece of military craft. A garrison of more than 5,000 men had been pulled off an island under the noses of a besieging enemy, using the region's near-permanent fog as cover, without the Allies realizing it had happened until they landed on empty ground. In its own way, it was exactly the kind of operation the force had been trained to appreciate, a triumph of stealth and misdirection over brute force. There is an irony in the fact that the force's first operation demonstrated, from the receiving end, the very principle of deception the unit would later master at Anzio. Kiska could easily read as a footnote, a comic anticlimax, but there is a harder truth inside it. The fog and confusion of the Kiska operation were genuinely dangerous even without an enemy present, and the broader Cottage operation saw casualties from friendly fire and accidents in the disorienting Aleutian murk. Soldiers keyed up for combat, moving through thick fog on unfamiliar ground, with weapons ready and nerves stretched, are a danger to one another even when no enemy exists. And for the men of the force, the psychological weight was real. They had trained for over a year, they had been carried to the literal edge of the continent, they had nerved themselves for their first battle, and they had been handed an empty rock. There is a particular kind of deflation in preparing everything you have for a moment that never arrives, the adrenaline with nowhere to go, the resolve that curdles into anticlimax. The force re-embarked and, by the 9th of September, 1943, returned to Fort Ethan Allen in Vermont, still without having fired a shot in anger. The men who had been recruited from the wilderness of two nations, trained to kill silently in the snow, had crossed an ocean to fight and found nobody home. If the story had ended there, the first Special Service Force would sit in history as a curious footnote, an expensive, elaborate unit that never saw combat. But the story did not end there, because on the other side of the world, in the mountains of Italy, the Allied advance had run into a wall, and that wall had a name. On the 27th of October, 1943, the first Special Service Force sailed from Hampton Roads, Virginia, aboard a British troopship called the Empress of Scotland, bound for Casablanca. From North Africa they moved to Italy, and in mid-November, the 19th by most accounts, they landed at Naples and went into the line alongside the U.S. 36th Infantry Division at Santa Maria. The situation they walked into was grim. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had stalled against a formidable German defensive system that historians call the Winter Line, or the Bernhard Line. The Germans, commanded in Italy by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had turned the mountainous spine of central Italy into a fortress. Peaks that dominated the valleys had been fortified, and Allied units were bleeding themselves against them. The German formations the force would come to know included some of the toughest in the theater, the 104th Panzergrenadier Regiment, and later, around Anzio, the paratroopers and armor of the Hermann Göring Division. These were no second-rate defenders. They were experienced, well-led, and dug into terrain that favored them enormously. The genius of the German defense in Italy was geographic. The peninsula is a ladder of mountain ranges running across the line of any advance from the south, and every ridge becomes a natural fortress. A defender who holds the high ground can see everything the attacker does and can pour fire down onto exposed slopes while remaining hard to reach. Kesselring's strategy was to make the Allies pay in blood for every ridge, to trade space for casualties and time, and to bleed the advance white in the mountains. It was working. And it was into this meat grinder, not the clean special operation the force had trained for, but a brutal, attritional mountain war, that the 1st Special Service Force was committed. One peak in particular had become a symbol of the deadlock. It was called Monte La Difensa, Hill 960 on the military maps. Difensa was a mountain that had already defeated conventional assaults. Its heights gave the German defenders command over the surrounding terrain, and its slopes were steep, exposed, and murderous. The men who tried to take it head-on were cut down by defenders firing from above. This was the situation into which the 1st Special Service Force was thrown. After all the training, all the waiting, all the anticlimax of Kiska, the force was finally being sent into combat, and it was being sent against one of the hardest objectives on the entire Italian front. The approach alone was a nightmare. One soldier later described the march toward Difensa in words that have survived. It looked as if we were marching into hell, he remembered, the whole mountain being shelled, the whole mountain seeming to be on fire. That was before the fighting even began. The assault on Monte La Difensa began on the night of the 2nd of December, 1943, as part of an operation codenamed Raincoat, and what the 1st Special Service Force did there is the reason the unit is remembered at all. The German defenders expected any attack to come up the mountain's more accessible southern approach, the direction from which conventional assaults had already come and failed. So the force did the opposite of what the defenders expected. Instead of grinding up the obvious slope into the teeth of the German guns, elements of the force scaled a steep rock face on the mountain's other side, an ascent the Germans had considered too sheer to defend heavily. The men climbed in darkness, in cold, carrying weapons and equipment, up terrain that the enemy had dismissed as impassable. And then they came over the top and fell upon the defenders from the direction no one was watching. The fighting was savage and close. The force took the summit of Difensa in a matter of hours, an objective that had held against conventional attacks, but taking ground and holding it are two different things, and the days that followed were where the force paid its price. German artillery, well registered on the peak, pounded the position. From the 6th to the 9th of December, the force pressed onto the connected height of Monte La Remetania, Hill 907. The combat, the exposure, and the relentless shelling ground the men down. Among the officers lost in the fighting on Difensa and the push to Remetania was Lieutenant Colonel T.C. McWilliam, a battalion commander in the 2nd Regiment. The loss of experienced leaders in these opening battles was a wound the force would feel for the rest of the campaign, because the whole value of the unit rested on the accumulated skill of men who could not be quickly replaced. Every trained forceman who fell represented over a year of specialized preparation that could not simply be regenerated by sending in a replacement. Now, the casualty figures for Difensa require a careful eye, because this is one of the places where the historical record disagrees with itself, and honesty demands we say so. One accounting, drawn from the commemorative history compiled by Ted Kemp, records 77% casualties, 511 total, with 91 dead, 9 missing, 313 wounded, and 116 cases of exhaustion. Another accounting, drawn from U.S. Army sources, records 73 killed rather than 91, alongside the same 313 wounded and 9 missing, plus those 116 men evacuated for the effects of weather and exhaustion. The exact number of dead depends on which source you trust. What no one disputes is that the force had taken one of the hardest peaks on the winter line, and had bled heavily to do it. The reasons behind these discrepancies deserve honesty rather than a papered-over surface, because the disagreements in the record are themselves part of the true story. Casualty accounting in mountain combat is genuinely difficult. Men listed as missing may later turn up wounded or dead. Men evacuated for exhaustion and exposure occupy a gray zone that different record keepers count differently. The line between a combat death and a death from the brutal conditions of a winter mountain is not always clean. When you see one source say 91 killed and another say 73, you are not necessarily seeing an error, you may be seeing two honest attempts to count the uncountable chaos of a battle fought in freezing darkness on a shell-swept peak. The responsible thing is not to pick the more dramatic number and present it as fact, but to show you both and let you understand that the fog of war extends even into the ledgers written afterward. There is a cross-domain truth worth pausing on here, because it explains why defensa mattered so much beyond the body count. The entire logic of the assault was what modern security engineers would recognize as attacking the unguarded surface. Any defended system, a mountain, a fortress, or for that matter a computer network, concentrates its protection where attack is expected and leaves the improbable approaches thin. The Germans hardened the obvious slope and dismissed the sheer rock face as impassable, exactly the way a modern organization hardens its front-facing login page and forgets the neglected side channel. The force found the unguarded surface and came through it. The principle that took Monte La Defensa in December 1943 is the same principle a penetration tester uses today, that the way in is almost never the door everyone is watching. The victory at Defensa announced the arrival of the 1st Special Service Force as a serious fighting formation, but it was only the beginning of the mountain campaign, and the winter of 1943 into 1944 would nearly destroy the unit that had climbed that rock face. After Defensa and Remitania, there was no rest. On the 25th of December, 1943, Christmas Day, the force captured Hill 720 from the direction of Monte Samacro. The war did not observe holidays. Then came the hardest fighting yet. On the 8th of January, 1944, the force assaulted Monte Maggio and Monte Visciataro, an engagement that produced the force's highest single battle casualties of the entire war. It was here, at Monte Maggio, that Robert Frederick, the commanding officer, the colonel who had called the whole enterprise a fiasco, was wounded 3 times. This was a commander who led from the front, close enough to the fighting to be hit repeatedly and keep going. The cumulative toll of the mountain campaign was staggering, and the numbers tell the story better than any adjective. The force had entered the Italian mountains at around 1,800 men. After Defensa and Visciataro, it was down to roughly 1,400. After Monte Maggio, the number of men still fit for combat had collapsed to around 400. In the span of a brutal winter, a unit of 1,800 had been reduced to 400 effective soldiers. 3 out of every 4 men who had climbed into those mountains were dead, wounded, missing, or too broken by cold and exhaustion to fight. This is the reality behind the legend of the Devil's Brigade, and it matters to sit with it before we get to the part everyone remembers. The force's reputation was not built by supermen who could not be touched. It was built by ordinary men from the forests and farms of 2 countries who were fed into some of the worst mountain fighting of the war and who kept taking their objectives even as their own ranks were annihilated around them. The force never failed a mission, but the cost of never failing was written in the arithmetic of that shrinking headcount: 1,800, then 1,400, then 400. There is a detail in the Monte Maggio fighting that captures the spirit of the unit better than any statistic. The men had trained, back in Montana, to use captured enemy weapons, a skill that must have seemed like an odd luxury at the time. At Monte Maggio, that training paid for itself. When German counterattacks came, forcemen who had seized enemy positions turned the captured German machine guns around and used them against the men trying to retake the ground. It is a small tactical fact, but it speaks to the philosophy of the whole enterprise, a force built to operate improvised, isolated, and behind the curve of normal supply, trained to make weapons of whatever the battlefield handed them, including the enemy's own guns. And through all of it, the commander bled alongside his men. Frederick's 3 wounds at Monte Maggio were not the injuries of a general caught by a stray shell at headquarters. They were the wounds of a man who insisted on being where the fighting was hardest. There is a kind of moral mathematics in an army, an unspoken accounting that soldiers keep of whether their leaders share their danger, and Frederick's 8 Purple Hearts across the war were, in that accounting, worth more than any speech. The men of the force knew that the officer who ordered them up the mountain was climbing it with them. The survivors were pulled off the line, and then, in the winter of 1944, what was left of the 1st Special Service Force was sent to a place where its reputation, the real one and the legendary one, would finally be forged. A beachhead below Rome, hemmed in by German forces, where the force would spend 99 days doing the thing that gave it its name. On the 2nd of February, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force landed at the Anzio beachhead. To understand what happened at Anzio, you need to understand the desperate situation there. The Allies had landed at Anzio in an attempt to outflank the German defensive lines and open the road to Rome, but the landing had bogged down into a bloody stalemate. Allied forces were pinned in a shallow beachhead, surrounded on the landward side by German forces occupying the high ground, subjected to constant artillery fire. The force was brought in specifically to replace the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions, which had been decimated in the fighting around Cisterna, filling the shoes of shattered units on one of the most dangerous stretches of ground in the entire European theater. The scale of what the force was asked to do at Anzio is almost hard to believe. According to the Montana Military Museum, the combined German and Italian strength around Anzio was estimated at 70,000 men, while the 1st Special Service Force, reduced by the mountain fighting, was assigned to hold over 8 miles of the beachhead's right flank with fewer than 1,100 men. Let that ratio settle. Fewer than 1,100 men, holding a frontage roughly twice what an entire division would normally be assigned, against an enemy that outnumbered the entire beachhead's attackers many times over. And they held it for 99 days without relief. To hold 8 miles of front with 1,100 men is, by any conventional military logic, impossible. A defensive line that thin should be trivial to penetrate, since there simply are not enough men to cover the ground. A determined attacker should be able to find a gap, pour through it, and roll up the defenders from the flank. That the force held anyway, for over 3 months, was not a matter of standing shoulder to shoulder in trenches. It was a matter of turning the whole logic of defense inside out. Rather than passively holding a line that was too long to hold, the force went on the offensive every night, pushing patrols and raiders into the German positions, keeping the enemy off balance, uncertain, and reactive. The best defense of an impossibly thin line turned out to be relentless aggression, making the enemy so worried about what the force might do to him that he never got around to testing how thin the force actually was. The 99-day stand at Anzio was, in a sense, a giant bluff backed by real violence, and it held. And the cost of holding it was real. The Anzio fighting cost the force 106 men killed or missing and over 300 wounded. Even in the role it was most suited for, the night raiding it had trained for and excelled at, the force bled steadily. There is no version of this unit's war that is free of that arithmetic. Every achievement has a column of casualties beneath it. It was at Anzio that the force became what history remembers. Unable to win by weight of numbers, because it had no numbers, the force turned to the skills it had trained for in the Montana snow. At night, the men would smear their faces with black boot polish, slip out of their own lines, and infiltrate deep into German-held territory. They moved silently. They killed silently. They gathered intelligence, ambushed patrols, raided positions, and then vanished back into the dark before dawn. They turned the night itself into a weapon, and they turned the ground between the lines, normally a barrier, into their hunting territory. Consider what this actually demanded of a man. To slip out of a defended line in darkness, cross ground that both sides watched and shelled, penetrate an enemy position where every figure was a potential killer, do violent work in near total silence, and then find your way back to your own lines before dawn without being shot by your own side. This ranks among the most psychologically punishing forms of combat there is. It offered none of the grim comfort of the massed attack, where a soldier is surrounded by his comrades and swept forward by the momentum of the group. The night raider is alone with his training and his nerve in the dark, a few yards from men who want to kill him. The force did this night after night, for the better part of 99 days. The Dermot O'Neill training in silent killing, the endless drilling, the wilderness recruitment of men already comfortable in darkness and cold, all of it converged here, on this ground, into a form of warfare that most units simply could not have sustained. And the effect on the Germans was cumulative and corrosive. Facing an enemy attack you can see coming is one thing. Lying in your position night after night knowing that silent men with blackened faces might already be inside your lines, that the sentry who stopped answering may not have fallen asleep, that morning might reveal a comrade killed without a sound and a printed card left on his body, that is something else entirely. This was warfare aimed not just at the enemy's soldiers but at his sleep, his nerves, and his sense that anywhere behind the front was safe. The force was manufacturing something more valuable than casualties. It was manufacturing dread. This is the origin of the black face paint that gave rise to the unit's most famous nickname, and this is where we have to stop and do the hard work of separating what happened from what was invented, because the story of the Black Devils, as it is usually told, contains one of the most famous quotes of the Second World War, a quote that may never have been said by anyone at all. Here is the legend as it is almost always told. During the fighting at Anzio, the men of the force found a diary on the body of a dead German officer, and in that diary was written a line that has echoed through every retelling of this story for 80 years. The Black Devils are all around us every time we come into the line, and we never hear them come. It is a perfect quote. It is the enemy himself, in his own private words, confessing his terror of these silent night raiders. It gave the unit its identity. The Black Devils. The Devil's Brigade. It is the emotional heart of the entire legend. And there is no verified evidence that it is true. This is the part of the story that most tellings quietly skip, and it deserves to be confronted directly, because the truth is genuinely more interesting than the myth. The plain fact, as stated in the historical record, is that this legend was never verified as fact by any member of the force. No authenticated German-language original of this diary has ever been produced. Not one. The most famous enemy quote of the unit's history exists only in English, only in retellings, with no surviving source document that anyone has been able to point to. So where did it come from? The trail leads not to a battlefield but to a newspaper. The public circulation of the phrase traces to a wartime correspondent, a reporter for the Toronto Daily Star named Clinton Conger, who referenced the Devil's Brigade and the German prisoner's diary entry. The quote entered history through journalism, not through a captured document sitting in an archive. And here is the theory that some historians have advanced, and it reframes everything. Some historians believe the tale of the captured diary was fabricated by the force's own officers, either as part of a deliberate psychological warfare campaign against the Germans, or as a way to boost morale among the commandos themselves. In other words, the most famous thing the enemy supposedly said about the Devil's Brigade may have been written by the Devil's Brigade. The nickname itself points the same direction. The name Black Devils appears to have been an invention of the force's own intelligence officers, and the blunt historical verdict on the more famous name is this: there is no record of any German ever referring to the force as the Devil's Brigade. That name, the one on the movie poster, the one in the video title, the one that has defined this unit for generations, was cemented not by the German army but by a Hollywood film released in 1968. Honesty cuts both ways, though, and it would be dishonest to leave you with the impression that the terror was entirely manufactured. There is a counter-anecdote, and it deserves its place. A forceman named Sergeant Victor Kaisner told a historian that he heard a German soldier whisper the words Schwarzer Teufel, Black Devil, as that German's throat was being cut. It is a single account, unverifiable, passed down through a book rather than a document, but it exists, and it suggests that whatever the officers invented for the newspapers, something real may also have been spoken in the dark. So what is the honest verdict? The 1st Special Service Force ran a genuine and effective campaign of night terror at Anzio. That part is documented. The men really did paint their faces black, really did raid silently behind enemy lines, really did leave the Germans jumpy and sleepless. But the single most famous piece of evidence for German fear, that diary quote, is unverified and quite possibly a piece of wartime propaganda produced by the force itself. The reputation was real. The most famous proof of it may be fiction. Both things are true at once, and a story that cannot hold both of them is not telling you the truth. There is a broader historical argument here worth confronting, because it challenges the entire framing of this unit, including the framing in the title of this very video. The popular image of the 1st Special Service Force is of an unstoppable band of supercommandos who terrified the German army. Some historians have pushed back on that image, and their pushback is not an attack on the force's courage but a correction to the myth. The reputation, in this more careful telling, was genuine in its foundations but significantly amplified after the war, first by a number of books, and then, above all, by the highly fictionalized Hollywood film of 1968 that gave the unit the name most people know it by. The scholarship complicates the supercommando picture in a specific way, because after Anzio, the force was increasingly used not as a scalpel for special operations but as shock troops in a straight infantry role for the Fifth Army. Its founder, Frederick, is documented as having ultimately recommended that the unit be reorganized as a conventional infantry regiment. The elite raiders became, in the end, elite infantry, used up in the line like other good units, because good units always get used up in the line. This matters, and not because it diminishes the force. It matters because the truth is more interesting than the legend, and because a channel that just repeats the movie version adds nothing you could not get from the movie. The honest picture is of a genuinely elite, genuinely effective unit whose real specialty, silent night infiltration, proved spectacularly successful in the specific conditions of Anzio, and which was then, like most elite units in that war, gradually fed into conventional roles where its special skills mattered less and its casualties mounted just the same. The legend flattens all of that into a simple story of invincible terror. The reality has texture, contradiction, and cost. If the diary quote sits in the realm of legend, the force's other psychological tactics are far better documented, and they are chilling in their deliberateness. Robert Frederick understood that fear is a weapon, and he used it consciously. This point about the men and the unit matters more than almost any other. Frederick did not stumble into a fearsome reputation by accident. He engineered it, deliberately, as a component of his operations, treating the enemy's psychology as a target as legitimate as any bunker or gun emplacement. The night raids inflicted casualties, yes, but Frederick understood that their greater value lived in what they did to the minds of the men who survived them. The force had cards, or stickers, printed with the unit's spearhead insignia and a slogan in red ink. The slogan was in German, and it read, "Das Dick Ende kommt nach." Colloquially, it means the worst is yet to come. More literally it translates to something like the thick end is coming soon, an implication that a much larger force was on its way. These cards were left on the bodies of German soldiers the force had killed, and on the fortifications the force had raided. Picture being a German soldier and finding, on the corpse of a comrade killed silently in the night, a printed card promising that this was only the beginning. That was the intended effect. The message was designed to crawl into the enemy's mind and stay there. In the most precise sense, it was a threat delivered to the survivors through the bodies of the dead, a message that said not only we were here but we can reach you whenever we choose, and we will be back. Few pieces of psychological warfare in the entire war were as economical or as chilling as a printed card in a dead man's pocket. The tactic worked well enough that the German command responded to it, and one of those responses survives. A captured German order, found on a prisoner at Anzio, warned German soldiers that they were fighting an elite Canadian-American force, describing that force as treacherous, unmerciful, and clever, and cautioning that they could not afford to relax. The order reportedly went so far as to offer a 10-day furlough to the first soldier or group of soldiers who managed to capture one of these men. When your enemy is offering vacation time as a reward for catching you, you have gotten inside his head. And there is a deception at Anzio that reveals just how cannily Frederick thought about the psychology of the enemy. Knowing that his fewer than 1,100 men could never match the German numbers, Frederick ordered trucks driven repeatedly around the area, over and over, to create the impression that a far larger force, a division-sized force, was present. And it worked. A captured German lieutenant later admitted that he had assumed the force was an entire division. Fewer than 1,100 men had convinced their enemy they were more than 10,000. Here we arrive at the second great cross-domain truth of this story, and it connects the Anzio beachhead to the device in your pocket. What Frederick was running at Anzio was, in modern terms, an information operation. The trucks, the calling cards, the invented diary quote, the deliberately cultivated nickname, none of these killed a single enemy soldier directly. What they did was shape the enemy's perception of reality until the enemy's own beliefs did the work. This is precisely the logic that governs modern influence campaigns online, where the goal is rarely to state a fact and always to shape a perception, to make a small thing look large, a scattered thing look coordinated, a manageable threat look overwhelming. Frederick, in 1944, with a truck and a printing press and a well-placed rumor to a newspaperman, was running the same play that shapes opinion on a global network 80 years later. He understood that what the enemy believes is true matters more than what is actually true. The Devil's Brigade was, among other things, one of the war's most effective perception management operations, and its greatest product may have been its own myth. The 99 days at Anzio finally ended when the stalemate broke. On the 25th of May, 1944, the Allied Fifth Army launched its breakout offensive, part of the larger Operation Diadem, and the 1st Special Service Force went on the attack against Monte Aristino. 2 days later, on the 27th of May, the force attacked Rocca Massima. The men who had spent 3 months as night raiders in a besieged beachhead were now on the offensive, driving toward the greatest prize in Italy. That prize was Rome. On the 4th of June, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force was among the very first Allied units to enter the Eternal City, moving in through the Porta San Paolo. Their task in the city was characteristically dangerous and precise, securing and clearing 7 bridges, removing German demolition charges before the retreating enemy could destroy them and cut the city in two. There is a poetry in the assignment that should not be missed. The force that had spent its war destroying things, power plants in theory, fortifications in practice, ended its Italian campaign preserving things, defusing charges to save the bridges of Rome from the retreating enemy. The unit built to demolish was, in the city's most important hour, the unit that kept it intact. In one of the war's cruel ironies of timing, the liberation of Rome, an event of enormous symbolic weight, the first Axis capital to fall, was almost immediately overshadowed in the world's newspapers. 2 days later, on the 6th of June, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, and Rome vanished from the headlines. The force had helped take the first Axis capital to fall, and the world's attention moved on within 48 hours. It stands as a fitting emblem for the whole story of the 1st Special Service Force, a unit that accomplished extraordinary things and then watched history look the other way, its achievements swallowed by larger events and, later, rewritten by a movie. The men who cleared the bridges of Rome earned a place in the headlines they never got. Change was coming for the force as well. On the 23rd of June, 1944, Robert Frederick, the men who had built the unit, led it from the front, and been wounded again and again, departed to take command of the 1st Airborne Task Force. Command of the 1st Special Service Force passed to Colonel Edwin Walker. The force that would fight the final chapter of its story would do so without the men who had shaped its entire identity. And that final chapter took place not in Italy, but in the south of France. On the 14th and 15th of August, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force took part in Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. Their specific objective was a pair of islands off the coast, Port Cross and the Isle du Levant, part of the Isles des Hères. These islands guarded the approaches to the invasion beaches, and their fortifications had to be neutralized. In the Battle of Port Cross and the fighting on the islands, the force captured 5 forts. 9 men were killed in the operation. The unit that had climbed Monte la Difensa was now conducting amphibious assaults on fortified Mediterranean islands, one more example of a force trained for one war fighting a completely different one. The island fighting in Operation Dragoon is another example of the force being handed a mission it was never designed for and executing it anyway. These men had been recruited as woodsmen and winter fighters, trained on skis and snow vehicles for a raid on Norwegian power plants. Now they were conducting amphibious assaults on fortified Mediterranean islands under a summer sun, capturing coastal forts to clear the way for a seaborne invasion of the French Riviera. The gap between what the force was built for and what it actually did had become almost total, and still it succeeded. 5 forts taken, the approaches cleared, at a cost of 9 men killed. Adaptability had become the unit's true specialty, more than any single tactic. The force's real skill was not snow warfare or night infiltration in isolation, but the capacity to be pointed at almost any hard problem and solve it. On the 22nd of August, 1944, the force was attached to Frederick's 1st Airborne Task Force, reuniting the unit with its founder in a new command relationship. 4 days later, on the 26th of August, the force fought a hard battle to capture Villeneuve-Loubet, a name worth remembering, because the forces' war would end very close to this same place just months later. And then, on the 5th of September, 1944, came one of the most remarkable single actions in the unit's history, an action that belongs as much to one man as to the force as a whole. Near a place called Lescarine, the force killed or captured an entire German battalion, roughly 1,000 men. The story of how that happened runs through a Canadian sergeant whose name deserves to be as famous as the unit itself. Sergeant Thomas George Prince was born on the 25th of October, 1915, on the Broken Head Ojibwe Nation in Manitoba. A descendant of Chief Peguis, he would become Canada's most decorated First Nations soldier of the Second World War. Among all the men who served in the force, Tommy Prince stands as one of only 3 Canadians to receive both the Canadian Military Medal and the American Silver Star during the war. Across his service in the Second World War and later in Korea, Prince would earn 11 medals. Prince embodied the exact skills the force was built around: silence, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to move unseen. These were not abilities the Army had taught him from scratch. They were, in part, the inheritance of a life lived close to the land, the woodcraft and patience of a man raised in a tradition that valued exactly the qualities the force was desperately trying to recruit. In this sense, Tommy Prince was the ideal forceman, not despite his background but because of it, the living embodiment of the recruitment letters that had gone looking for hunters and woodsmen who already knew how to move unseen through wild country. At Monte Maggio, during the terrible fighting in the Italian mountains, Prince single-handedly neutralized German gun emplacements in silence. He received no award for that particular action, and the reason is telling, because an award would have required documenting the classified stealth techniques he had used, and those techniques were too valuable to expose. Think about what that means. Tommy Prince performed an act worthy of a decoration, and the decoration was withheld precisely because he had done it too well, because the methods he used were so effective that the Army would rather leave his heroism unrecorded than risk revealing how it had been accomplished. His skill was so effective that describing it was considered a security risk. Few soldiers in any war can claim that their courage went unmedaled because it was classified. The most famous Tommy Prince story comes from Italy, and it is worth telling in full because it captures the man completely. Prince ran a telephone line from the force's position out to an abandoned farmhouse that sat close to the German lines. From inside that farmhouse, hidden, he observed the German positions and reported their movements back over the wire for days. At one point, the telephone line was cut. Rather than abandon his post, Prince disguised himself as a farmer, an ordinary civilian tending his land, and walked out into full view of the German observers to repair the broken line, pretending to be a peasant fussing over his fields while enemy soldiers watched. He fixed the line under their gaze and returned to his hidden reporting. It is an act of nerve that borders on the unbelievable, and it is documented. Then came L'Escarine, in southern France, in September of 1944, where Tommy Prince and the entire force come together in a single action. According to Veterans Affairs Canada, Prince walked 70 kilometers across rugged, mountainous terrain to report the intelligence he had gathered on the German positions, and then led the brigade to the enemy encampment. His own Silver Star citation records the result in the flat, official language of a military award, that so accurate was the report rendered by the patrol that Prince's regiment moved forward on the 5th of September, 1944, occupied new heights, and successfully wiped out the enemy bivouac area. The 1,000-man German battalion the force destroyed that day was found because one man walked 70 kilometers over mountains to find it. And here the story of Tommy Prince turns from triumph to something harder, because his life after the war is inseparable from his heroism in it. Prince had fought as an equal in an elite binational unit, decorated by two nations, one of only 3 Canadians in the entire war to hold both the Canadian Military Medal and the American Silver Star. On the battlefield, his skill and courage had made him the equal of any man in the force, and he returned to a Canada where, as an Indigenous man, that equality did not follow him home. He would serve his country again in Korea, adding to his tally of medals, and still the recognition and the equal treatment that his service should have guaranteed did not materialize in his civilian life. He died in poverty, on the 25th of November, 1977. The indignities extended even into how his story was told. When the 1968 film about the force was made, Tommy Prince, a specific man, with a specific name, a specific heritage, and a specific record of extraordinary courage, was reduced to a character called simply Chief, a generic indigenous figure stripped of the identity he had earned. His actual medals, the 11 he earned across 2 wars, are now held in trust at the Manitoba Museum, preserved for a nation that did not always preserve the man himself. The most decorated Indigenous soldier of his generation, a man whose single reconnaissance destroyed an enemy battalion of 1,000 men, stands as a reminder that the force's story does not end cleanly, and that the men who made the legend were not always treated as legends by the countries they served. Any honest telling of the Devil's Brigade has to hold both halves of Tommy Prince, the astonishing soldier, and the men his country failed. To tell only the first half would be its own kind of lie. The 1st Special Service Force did not fade away. It was ended, deliberately, in a field. After the fighting in southern France, the force moved on the 7th of September, 1944, to defensive positions on the border between France and Italy, the same mountainous frontier where the unit's Mediterranean War had been waged. And then, on the 5th of December, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force was disbanded. The disbandment happened on the flats near the Lou River, close to Villeneuve-Loubet, in the region near Menton in southeastern France. The precise location has been recorded variously, some sources saying Menton, some saying Villeneuve-Loubet, some saying Nice, but they all refer to the same corner of the French Riviera where the forces' war came to its administrative end. The reasons for the disbandment were practical. The specialized mission the force had been built for no longer existed in a war that had become a broad conventional advance, and its men were needed elsewhere, its Canadians eventually returning to Canadian formations. But the manner of the ending mattered. In a final ceremony, the Canadians paraded past the Americans in a last salute, two national contingents that had been welded into a single force in the Montana snow, now formally separating for the last time. The men who had blended their bagpipes and their marching commands, who had climbed Die Fensa together and raided Anzio together and taken Rome together, said goodbye on a field in France. There is a particular weight to that final parade that deserves to be felt. For over 2 years, the fact that a man was American or Canadian had been made deliberately, operationally irrelevant. In the sections and platoons of the force, the two nationalities had been so thoroughly fused that the seam had, by design, disappeared. And now, at the end, that seam was being restored. The Canadians would go back to Canadian formations. The Americans would go their own way. The unique thing the force had been, the one genuinely binational fighting unit of the entire war, was being unmade, and the two halves that had learned to be a single body were being separated back into their national parts. That the Canadians marked the moment by parading past the Americans in salute suggests the men themselves understood what was being lost. They had become something together that neither nation had been able to build alone, and they knew they were watching it end. The precise reasons for the disbandment were, again, practical rather than dramatic. The specialized role the force had been created for had long since ceased to exist, and the war in the West had become a broad conventional advance in which a small, specialized, half-Canadian unit was an administrative complication as much as a military asset. Elite units are expensive to maintain and difficult to fit into a conventional order of battle, and by late 1944 the force's original rationale was 3 cancellations deep: the Norway mission gone, the special operations role increasingly replaced by conventional infantry work, the binational structure a bureaucratic oddity. So the decision was made to end it. But the ending on that field near Menton was not a failure. It was the retirement of a unit that had done everything asked of it and more. That day is remembered. Every 5th of December, American and Canadian Special Forces commemorate the 1st Special Service Force with a combined parachute jump, a pass in review, and a formal ball. They call it Menton Day. The unit that was disbanded in a field near Menton is, in a sense, reformed in ceremony every single year by the soldiers who trace their lineage back to it. And that lineage is the final, and perhaps most important, part of this story, because the 1st Special Service Force did not really die on that field. It became the seed of something much larger. Here is the claim that elevates the 1st Special Service Force from a fascinating wartime unit to a genuinely foundational one. 2 of the most elite military organizations in North America today trace their direct descent to it. On the American side, the United States Army Special Forces, the soldiers the world knows as the Green Berets, trace their formal lineage as the 1st Special Forces Regiment back to the 1st Special Service Force. The connection is not merely spiritual. It is official and ceremonial. In 1960, Robert Frederick himself, the founder of the force, presented the original colors of the 1st Special Service Force to the 7th Special Forces Group, physically handing the identity of the wartime unit to its Cold War successors. And the connection is honored to this day in a specific, tangible way, because any soldier who served 120 days or more with the 1st Special Service Force was authorized to wear the Special Forces tab, an honor created in 1983 and awarded retroactively to those wartime force men. On the Canadian side, the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, known as CSOR, part of the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, likewise claims direct descent from the force. The binational unit produced binational descendants, an elite American Special Operations lineage and an elite Canadian Special Operations lineage, both tracing their roots to the same 1,800 men who trained at Fort Harrison. This is why the force matters beyond its own battles. The night raids at Anzio, the black face paint, the silent infiltration, the small teams operating behind enemy lines, these were not just tactics that won particular fights in 1944. They were the prototype for how elite special operations forces would fight for the next 80 years. When a modern special forces team infiltrates hostile territory in small numbers, moving silently, striking precisely, and vanishing, it is running an operational concept that the first Special Service Force helped prove could work. The force was a test case for a whole category of warfare. The cultural afterlife of the force reflects this outsized influence. The 1968 film that gave the unit its popular name, with William Holden playing a version of Frederick, fixed the Devil's Brigade in public memory, though, as the veterans themselves noted, that film took considerable liberties, portraying the American recruits as a collection of stockade misfits redeemed by combat, a fiction that seems to have borrowed its shape from another popular film of the era about convicts sent to war. The real American recruits were not criminals earning redemption. They were volunteers screened for outdoor skills. The veterans disliked the portrayal, and it is easy to see why, because the movie replaced their actual identity, highly selected wilderness specialists, with a more marketable Hollywood cliché. Decades later, the force's influence surfaced again when the filmmaker Quentin Tarantino cited the unit as an inspiration for his 2009 film about a band of Allied soldiers waging psychological war behind enemy lines, whose members wore collar insignia and an arrowhead patch echoing the force's own. The unit that ran one of the war's most effective, real psychological operations became, fittingly, an inspiration for fictional ones. The honors accumulated over time as well. The force received the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Gilt Star and a United States Distinguished Unit Citation for its combat record. And in a gesture that closed a very long circle, in 2006 the Canadian members of the force were awarded the United States Army Combat Infantryman Badge, American recognition, 6 decades late, for Canadian soldiers who had fought under a joint flag. There is a way to understand this that connects the force to something far outside the military world entirely. The first Special Service Force functioned like a proof of concept, the working prototype that demonstrates a radical idea is viable before anyone is willing to invest in it at scale. Before the force, the notion of a small, elite, specially trained unit conducting independent operations behind enemy lines was theoretical, the kind of thing a man like Jeffrey Pike might sketch out and a man like Frederick might call a fiasco. The force was the prototype that proved the concept worked in the field, under fire, against a real enemy. And once the prototype proved viable, the concept was scaled up into the permanent special operations establishments of two nations. Every prototype that succeeds does the same thing, justifying the enormous investment that follows. The force paid for its proof in the arithmetic of that shrinking headcount in the Italian mountains, but it proved the concept, and the institutions built on that proof are still operating today. There is one more layer to this, and it closes the circle back to where the story began. Recall that the entire enterprise started with an idea the professionals thought was probably unworkable, Pike's fantastical plow, which Frederick himself branded a fiasco. The mission that justified the force's creation was cancelled. By every conventional measure, the project should have been a failure, an expensive unit built for a mission that never happened, based on a plan its own commander despised. And yet out of that apparent failure came one of the most influential military experiments of the century. The force is a case study in how the value of an effort is often completely different from its stated purpose. Pike wanted to blow up Norwegian power plants. He never did. What he actually set in motion was the proof that elite special operations forces could work, a result worth infinitely more than the destruction of any power plant, and one that nobody involved at the start could have predicted. The lesson reaches far beyond warfare, that sometimes the thing you build fails at its intended job and succeeds spectacularly at a job no one knew they were trying to do. For decades, the story of the first Special Service Force was known mostly to military historians and to the dwindling ranks of the men who had served in it. Recognition, when it finally came at the highest level, came very late. In 2013, the Congress of the United States voted to award the first Special Service Force its highest honor, the Congressional Gold Medal. The authorizing legislation was signed into law on the 12th of July, 2013, and it is in the official language of that law that we find the most authoritative summary of what the force actually accomplished, a summary that cuts through the legends and the movie mythology to state the documented record. According to the congressional record, during 251 days of combat, the force suffered 2,314 casualties, or 134% of its authorized strength, captured thousands of prisoners, won 5 United States campaign stars and 8 Canadian battle honors, and never failed a mission. Sit with that one figure, 134% of its authorized strength lost as casualties. A unit of roughly 1,800 authorized men absorbed casualties exceeding its entire authorized number, sustained over its existence by replacements, and it never once failed to take an objective it was ordered to take. That is the verified record, stated by an act of Congress, and it needs no embellishment. The medal itself was presented on the 3rd of February, 2015, in Emancipation Hall at the United States Capitol. 42 veterans of the original 1800 commandos were honored there that day, old men, in their 80s and 90s, receiving at last the recognition their unit had earned 70 years earlier. Because a Congressional Gold Medal is awarded collectively, only a single medal was struck, and it came to reside at the home of American Special Operations. On behalf of the entire force, the medal was accepted by a Canadian veteran, Charles Mann, and an American veteran, Eugene Gutierrez Jr., one from each nation, exactly as the force itself had always been. There is something worth pausing on in that image. 42 very old men gathered in the Capitol to receive an honor for a unit that had been disbanded 70 years before. When these men trained at Fort Harrison, they were in their 20s, single, recruited for their youth and their toughness and their comfort in wild country. By the time their nation formally recognized what they had done, they were in the last chapter of their lives, and most of their comrades were already gone. The Congressional Gold Medal is the highest honor the United States Congress can bestow on civilians, and here it was, arriving for these men at the very end. Recognition delayed is still recognition, but the length of the delay tells its own story about how easily even extraordinary service can be overlooked while the people who rendered it are still young enough to enjoy the acknowledgement. Canada honored its own as well. Canadian veterans of the force received the medal, and in the years that followed, the recognition continued on both sides of the border. In November of 2018, the Canadian War Museum unveiled a gold-plated replica of the medal, and 3 of the original veterans attended the unveiling, men named Jack Callowhill, Jim Summersides, and Ralph Mayville, then in their 90s, still standing for the force. 3 men, out of the 1,800 who had once filled the ranks, present to see their unit honored in the National Museum of one of the 2 countries that had created it. Each of those unveilings and ceremonies in the years that followed was, in a real sense, one of the last chances for the living to speak for the force before the last of them was gone. The physical memory of the force is preserved across both countries. In Montana, a stretch of Interstate 15 running from Helena toward the Canadian border was named the first Special Service Force Memorial Highway. In Alberta, a highway was similarly named to commemorate the route Canadian recruits had traveled south to Fort Harrison, so that the very roads the recruits once traveled to reach their training now carry the unit's name. There are memorials in Helena, plaques in Rome, and a marble plaque in Menton. The war dead of the force lie in the Commonwealth Cemetery at Anzio and in the American Cemetery at Nettuno. 2 nations, having sent their men to fight as one, remember them as one. The living memory of the force is kept as well, and kept in a way that ties directly back to the bloodline. The first Special Service Force Association has held reunions for decades, carrying the unit's memory forward through the men who served in it and, increasingly, through the descendants and successors who inherit its legacy. The association awards an annual honor named for Robert Frederick, the Frederick Award, given to the top enlisted operator from both the American Special Forces and the Canadian Special Operations community. Think about what that award represents. Every year, the founder's name is placed on the chest of the best enlisted men from each of the 2 nations' elite units, the modern heirs of the very force he built. The binational unit produces, to this day, a binational honor, given by an association that refuses to let the force be forgotten. The men of the force are also remembered in the museums of both countries, from the Montana Military Museum at Fort Harrison where it all began, to exhibits in Calgary and Halifax and elsewhere, to the Museum of the American GI in Texas that preserves the uniforms and equipment these men once wore. By the time the 80th anniversary of the force's disbandment came around, on the 5th of December, 2024, essentially all of the original members had passed. The youngest of them, had any survived, would have been past 100 years old. The generation that climbed Difensa and raided Anzio and cleared the bridges of Rome is gone now. What remains is the record, the memorials, the annual jump on Menton Day, and the two elite military lineages that still trace their descent to 1,800 men in the Montana snow. So let's return to where we began, and to the promise this video made at the start, to separate what actually happened from what was invented, and to show that the truth is more impressive than the myth. The myth says the first Special Service Force was so terrifying that a doomed German officer confessed his fear of the Black Devils in his private diary. The truth is that no such diary has ever been verified, that the quote may have been manufactured by the force's own officers, and that no German is on record ever calling the unit the Devil's Brigade, a name that was cemented by a Hollywood film in 1968. But here is what the truth also says. It says that 1,800 men from two countries were recruited from the forests and farms of North America to die on a mission to Norway that was cancelled before they ever fired a shot. It says they crossed an ocean to a battle on Kiska that turned out to have no enemy at all. It says they were then thrown against Monte La Difensa, climbed a rock face the Germans thought impassable, and took a peak that had defeated conventional attacks, and that by the end of the mountain campaign, a unit of 1,800 had been ground down to 400 men still able to fight. It says they held over 8 miles of the Anzio beachhead with fewer than 1,100 men for 99 days without relief, and that they ran a campaign of psychological warfare so effective that their enemy offered furloughs to anyone who could catch one of them. It says a Canadian sergeant named Tommy Prince walked 70 kilometers over mountains and destroyed a 1,000-man battalion, and then came home to a country that let him die in poverty. And it says that across 251 days of combat, this force suffered casualties equal to 134% of its own strength and never failed a single mission. The force did not need the Germans to invent a name for it. Its own record was enough. The diary quote is probably a myth, but the men who supposedly inspired it were entirely real, and what they actually did was harder and costlier and more consequential than any invented quote could capture. They proved that a small, elite, binational force could do what larger armies could not, and in proving it, they became the seed from which the modern special forces of two nations grew. There is a final thought worth leaving you with, because it reframes what the unit the Nazis feared really means. The fear, whatever its exact measure, was never the point. Fear was a tool Frederick used, a weapon he manufactured as deliberately as any bullet. The point was what the fear was in service of, taking objectives that could not otherwise be taken, holding ground that could not otherwise be held, and proving something about the nature of elite forces that two nations would build upon for the rest of the century. If the Germans feared the Black Devils, that fear was a means to an end, and the end was the record, 251 days, never a failed mission, a lineage that endures. And that record was written by specific, real, mortal men. By Robert Frederick, wounded 8 times, leading from the front until his own body was a map of the war. By Tommy Prince, moving unseen across 70 kilometers of mountain, brilliant in the field and failed at home. By Lieutenant Colonel MacWilliam, who died on the approach to Remetania. By the anonymous soldier who looked up at Monte La Difensa and said it looked as if they were marching into hell. By the 42 old men who gathered in the capital 70 years later to receive a medal for what they had done as young men in the snow and the mountains and the dark. These were not the invincible supercommandos of the movie. They were better than that, because they were real, and because what they actually endured and accomplished was harder than any fiction. That is the real legacy of the Devil's Brigade. Not a line in a diary that may never have existed, but a bloodline that runs directly from a field near Menton in 1944 to the Special Operations Forces of the United States and Canada today. The name was a legend. The force was not. And every 5th of December, the men who inherited what those 1,800 proved still jump from the sky to remember them.